Here we are on the second part of section 14.2, and we're going to talk about the brain and the parts. And this does take some time to sit down and remember these. So get out your pictures when you study and practice. Okay, so this is kind of the parts and what they do. The brain has four major parts. The largest part of the brain, when you look at the brain, most of what you see is the cerebrum. This big part's the cerebrum. The second largest part down here is called the cerebellum, and kind of the word was crafted after the idea of little cerebrum. The cerebrum's the biggest part of the brain. The cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain. Then we have this part kind of in the middle, that's the diencephalon. And the part, let's see, we have the spinal cord coming up here. So the part that's continuous with the spinal cord and kind of looks like a stem, if this were a flower, this would be the stem, is called the brainstem. So the four major parts of the brain, the largest part, the cerebrum, the next largest, the cerebellum, the middle part is the diencephalon, and the part connected to the spinal cord is the brainstem. I'm going to talk a little bit about the cerebrum. So there's four parts of the brain, and there's four parts of the cerebrum. Okay, these are the four major parts of the brain. Here's the four major parts of the cerebrum, the largest part of the brain. So there's the cerebrum there. There's the cerebellum. There's the brainstem. You can't see the diencephalon because it's kind of in the middle there. So if you look at the cerebrum, there's four sections we call lobes. And here's the frontal lobe, which is in the front. The temporal lobe, which is at your temples. The parietal lobe is in this middle part. And the occipital lobe is in the back. You touch the back of your head, that's where your occipital lobe is. So there's four major parts of the brain: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the brainstem, and inside is the diencephalon. And then there's four major parts of the cerebrum: the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. So be able to identify those on pictures. One of the vocabulary words I want you to be able to find, and one of the structures I want you to find, is the corpus callosum. And that's this thing right here. And so if you were to, so this is what do we call that section where we divide the left and the right? Remember sagittal section? So here's a sagittal section of the brain. So we had to, somebody in this picture, theoretically, you'd have to cut through, separate the left and the right half of the brain to get this. And this piece right here that's associated with the cerebrum that you'd have to cut in half to get two halves of the cerebrum is called the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is the brain tissue that connects the right and the left side of the cerebrum. I'm pretty sure in lab we talk about that. I wanted you just to look at the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe and talk about some of the major functions. The cerebrum itself, some of the most important things that the cerebrum does are in the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe. So when we look at this cerebrum, obviously it's the largest part of the brain, and it's the part of the brain that is most different between humans and animals and other animals. The cerebrum in humans is much more well developed. And so a lot of why humans are more intelligent than other animals is due to what goes on in the cerebrum. In fact, most of what makes us more intelligent is due to what goes on in the cerebrum. And in particular, it's the frontal lobe that has a lot of these uniquely human traits. And so look at what's going on in that frontal lobe. Planning, learning, decision-making, all of these things are things that humans far exceed in intellect compared to other forms of life. Our behavior is controlled by neurons in the cerebrum. Voluntary muscle movements, for me to say, I'm going to snap my fingers. For me to lift my arm and move my fingers in that way, that idea that those signals to my muscles had to come from my frontal lobe of my cerebrum. Processing sensory information, like, oh, that hurt. We process that in the frontal lobe. Memory, emotions, attention, speech, all these really complex, higher level functions generally happen in the cerebrum. So our cerebrum, if you had to say which single part of the brain is most human, most uniquely human, I would say the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. In fact, we look at sheep brains in lab, like usually when we have a live lab, we'll look at sheep brains. And one of the things you'll notice is the frontal lobe is a lot smaller in sheep than humans. It's not as well developed. The other lobe I want you to get a little bit of appreciation for is the occipital lobe. And occipital somehow sounds like ocular, or makes it sound like eye. And it actually is the part of the brain that processes visual information. So we have nerves coming out of the back of our eyes, and our sensory information, all that stuff going on with light and dark and color, gets transferred to the occipital lobe, and the occipital lobe interprets that as, oh, that's a box, oh, that's a flower, that's a fish, whatever it is, whatever you're looking at. Our occipital lobe processes visual information. So it says it's seeing, recognizing, identifying the visual world. So somebody who's blind, their occipital lobe functions much differently than somebody who has normal vision. In fact, apparently people that are blind, a lot of times, some of their occipital lobe gets directed to just being aware of what's around them, like physically. It kind of gets remapped, and it doesn't interpret visual information as much as it interprets like touch and awareness of where they are in space. So anyway, so the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe of the cerebrum are two of the four very important parts. So what's the importance of the corpus callosum and the cerebral hemispheres? So we said the corpus callosum is that brain tissue that connects the right and the left side of the cerebrum. In fact, if you look at, this is the cerebrum looking at it from an aerial view from the top. And there's kind of two separate sides. We have what we call the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And here's that corpus callosum. You'd have to cut through here to cut through that. And so it turns out that the cerebrum has a right and a left side. And one couple of the kind of odd things about it is sensory stimulus from the right side of the body is interpreted in that occipital lobe on the left side of the brain. So if you had damage to your occipital lobe on the left side of your brain, but not the right side, you might lose vision in your right eyeball. So sensory information from my right eyeball goes to the left side of the brain. If I damage the left side of my brain in this occipital lobe, I might not be able to interpret visual information coming from the right eye. The same thing happens with motor control. If you want to wave your right hand, that impulse comes from the left side of your brain, the left side of your cerebrum. So and vice versa, waving your left hand, that motor information comes from the right side of the brain. And I like to point this out because sometimes people have a stroke, which means they have damage to the brain, often due to a blood clot. So there's damage let's say you got damage in the left hemisphere, but the left side of your body moves fine. It's the right side of your body that you might lose function. You might lose motor control on the right side. Having a stroke on the left, damaging the left side of your brain, can affect motor and sensory information on the right side of the body, and vice versa. Damage to the right side of the brain can affect motor and sensory function on the left side of the body. The other thing is that the brain is not homogeneous. That you can see on the left side of the brain, there's tissue that's more involved in forming our speech and language and comprehension of speech and language. Again, sometimes people get a stroke and they can't talk. Typically, that would be a stroke on the left side of their body because the left side of our cerebrum is involved with speech. And you can just see here on the right side of the body, there's a place that's involved in recognition of faces. There are certain conditions that people can no longer recognize people's faces. They can't tell one person from another. That would be damage to the right side of the brain. So what I'd like to point out is the right and the left sides of the brain do different things. It's not all symmetrical. So you have damage to one part of the brain. It might only affect a very specific function. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about with cerebrum. The second part of the brain I want to talk about is the diencephalon. We said the diencephalon was that kind of middle part of the brain. And attached to the diencephalon is a gland we call the pituitary gland. And I have down here that the pituitary gland is what we call the master gland. It produces many hormones, and it affects a lot of parts of our bodies. It affects our thyroid, it affects our reproductive tract, and so it affects how we grow, all sorts of things. So the pituitary gland is really important when we're talking about our hormones. And so that hangs off of the diencephalon. Other things the diencephalon does is it acts as a relay station for sensory information. So let's say you're touching something and the impulse, the sensory receptors, stimulate neurons, and that impulses go up to your brain and it ends up in some part of your brain where it says, oh, that was hot. Your brain's going to interpret that as hot or rough or smooth or whatever you were touching. And so what has to happen is those impulses go up through the diencephalon, and the diencephalon kind of acts as a relay station and says, oh, that's touch information, it goes over here. Oh, that's visual information, it goes over there. So it kind of acts as a relay station, sending information to the appropriate part of the brain. It's highly involved in homeostasis because of the pituitary gland and because it interfaces with other hormones and the endocrine system. So the diencephalon is a relay station for sensory information. It's involved in homeostasis because of its function with the pituitary gland and other hormones. And that pituitary gland is what we call the master gland because it controls other endocrine glands. The brainstem is the third part of the brain. So we had the cerebrum, the diencephalon, and now the brainstem. And so the brainstem is continuous with the spinal cord. And so impulses from the body are coming up through the spinal cord, and then they go into this brainstem. All this is brainstem. You can see there's multiple parts. And the brainstem I have on here, it's the most primitive part of the brain. And what that means is most animals will have some version of a brainstem. Even the simplest animals, the simplest organisms, will have brain tissue that's similar to our brainstem. Remember, we said the cerebrum has some very complex higher functions, but the brainstem is more primitive, that it's more, any organism that has a brain is going to have some kind of brainstem function. And what that means is it's going to control the basic things that you need to live. Breathing, heartbeat, blood pressure, your gastrointestinal tracts. How does your stomach work? How do your intestines work? Your brainstem can coordinate movements, like your eyes in response to sound. I always like to point this out. Because think about if somebody was, oh, you're just sitting there studying and all of a sudden the dog barks. What are you going to do? You're going to turn your head and your eyes are going to go with it. You're going to turn your eyes and your head towards the dog and you're going to respond to that sound. You don't turn your head and then turn your eyes. They're kind of coordinated together. And the reason why I like to point this out is that this is a really primitive response. There was a story in the news. You know how sometimes these personal stories get in the news about a family wanting to allow a daughter to die. She was in a vegetative state, and somebody in the family wanted to disconnect her life support. Other people didn't want to, and there was a big court case. And one of the things that the family said was, you know, the doctor was saying she's brain dead. Her cerebrum is not functioning. And the family says, but every once in a while I say something and she turns her head and looks at me. And what's happening is that's just a primitive reflex. It's not showing that she's aware that you're there. It's not showing you that she's thinking. It's really one of the most primitive things our brain does. So the fact that her eyes could turn in response to a sound is a very primitive thing that's controlled by the brainstem. So let's see. We got the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebrum that does the big thinking, the diencephalon that's the relay station and controls the pituitary gland, the brainstem that has our primitive functions like breathing and heartbeat, and then the last part of the brain down here is the cerebellum. And the cerebellum controls something that you might not even realize you have. It's called proprioception. Proprioception is the ability to be aware of where your body is in space. For example, you're sitting there in front of your computer. I don't know, I have a keyboard in front of me. I'm going to close my eyes. I can reach over and touch my mouse. I did it first try. I can close my eye and touch my ear. Both of those I did without any visual information, except for the visual information that's being stored in my cerebellum. So your cerebellum is kind of making a map of where your body is relative to everything around you all the time. So when I can look at that, I can look at my mouse, I can close my eyes, and I can reach over and touch my mouse because my cerebellum was able to know where my hand was, draw a picture in my brain relative to where the mouse is, and I could move my hand over there. That's what we call proprioception. The cerebellum's involved in proprioception. It's involved in balance and coordination. And the reason why I have, I had the basketball players there, is I read an article about a study one time, and it said, if you practice, if they took 3 people, one person did nothing. One person practiced shooting balls into a basket. Another person, or group of people, watched people shooting balls into a basket. Okay, so we've got 3 groups. One group that did nothing at all to do with basketball. One group actually played basketball, shot the basket a lot, and one group watched people shoot the basket. What happens when you practice a physical activity is you develop your proprioception. You become better and better at learning where your body is in space. Somebody who is a baseball player, the more they practice, the better they get at hitting the ball because they get a better sense of where the ball is compared to their body. And so these can be skills are results in changes in the cerebellum. You get better proprioception. So the people that shot the baskets were better at shooting baskets. Obviously, they got better proprioception. They improved their skill. The people that did nothing had no improvement over shooting baskets. They shot baskets, they did nothing, and then they shot baskets again. They didn't get any better. the people that shot baskets for kind of counted how many they could do, then practiced shooting baskets, counted again, and they actually got better. But the thing that was kind of weird is the people that just watched people shoot baskets actually got slightly better at shooting baskets. And they traced it to changes in the cerebellum. So even watching an athletic performance can have an impact on your cerebellum. Now, you're never going to get to be good at it, but it can slightly change your cerebellum by even watching activities that can affect your cerebellum. I have this guy on here because one of the most striking places that our brain is affected by alcohol is the cerebellum, and it affects our proprioception. So what is he doing here? When you do that field sobriety test, one of the things they ask you to do is close your eyes, put your hands out to your sides, and touch your nose. And that's proprioception. Where is your nose in space? They ask you to walk in a straight line, balance and coordination. So what this field sobriety test is doing is it's testing the function of your cerebellum. So there you go. So go through the 4 parts of the brain. What are their major functions? And we also had 4 parts of the cerebrum. And what are the functions of the frontal and the occipital lobes? So practice those. Good luck. That's the end.